The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, what do the numbers have to say about who is requesting medically assisted death in Canada? We'll explore that. First up, we speak to the mayors of Sault Ste. Marie and North Bay about why Northern Ontario needs more, not less, immigration. That's next on the agenda. Northern Ontario mayors are looking to the federal government for answers on an immigration pilot program that resettles newcomers in the north. Joining us to discuss why skilled immigration is crucial to economic development north of the French River, we welcome Peter Chirko, the mayor of North Bay, Ontario, and with us here in studio, Matthew Shoemaker, the mayor of Sault Ste. Marie. Your worships, good to have you both on our program tonight. Thank you for joining us. And Mayor Shoemaker, let's start with you. The Rural and Northern Immigration Pilot Program. That's what we're starting here. RNIP, I guess for short. What was it?
Well, it was a program that was really, I would say, modeled after the Atlantic Canada immigration program that the federal government had introduced early in their term in 2015, and had some success at attracting skilled labor force immigrants to Atlantic Canada. So it was examined by my predecessor and the predecessors in the north and looked at as a model that could be implemented across Northern Ontario to attract skilled labor force, because there has been a shortage of skilled industrial workers, healthcare sector workers in all of our communities. And the program was implemented by the federal government as a pilot, which has now ended, and proved very successful. So we're hoping it will be re-implemented in short order.
Mayor Chirko, why was North Bay chosen to participate in this?
Well, I think it was because the community really, as all of our northern communities, we did have that labor shortage, as Mayor Shoemaker pointed out. There was opportunities to bring skilled workers to our communities, along with training that our colleges, our universities also geared up for. And so I think the application that when the initial request from IRCC came out in 2018, 2019, that we looked at our community, what do we need? Are we able to participate? And we were one of the 11 communities across Canada that, including all of our counterparts in Northern Ontario, that were successful in running this program. In my prior life before becoming mayor, I was the president and CEO of the Chamber of Commerce, and we were the lead agency on the RNIP file. And it proved extremely successful for our community, and we look forward to what's next.
How about in the Sioux? Was it successful there?
Hugely successful. We had 245 employers take advantage of the RNIP program. We had 1,800 immigrants come to the community, about 1,000 workers and 800 family members, give or take. And that is in the matter of 4 years, from when the program was started in 2020, or when we accepted our first invitees in 2020 to 2024, when the program closed. We got 1,800 people just in our community. Across all of Northern Ontario in the 5-year period between 2011 and 2016, there were 2,200 immigrants resettled in the north. So it was shows the success you can have when you target programs to the communities that have these needs. And it has been a huge success. We had our population grow for the first time in 40 years in Sault Ste. Marie, as largely as a result of this program.
Follow up on that, because more than 100,000 people move to Toronto every year. So if people watching us from south of the French River here, we had 1,800 people, our population increased by that much because of this program in Sault Ste. Marie. To them, that's not going to sound like much of a success. But in terms of numbers up north, what does that mean?
It's about 5% population growth. So our community is about 75,000, or was 75,000 when I took office, about 78,000 now, largely as a result of being able to target specific skill sets for specific jobs that are going unfilled. And, there's a debate in Canada going around. I'm sure you'll get to it at some point, but there's a debate in Canada about what the right number of immigration levels are for the country as a whole, because of the cost of housing, because of the lack of availability of housing. And the reality is that programs like RNIP target skill sets that are needed in our communities and that are short in our communities, and match people that have those skill sets with the jobs when they can't be filled, locally or domestically. So it's not, a question of whether or not we should add 50,000 or 100,000 more immigrants. It's a question of what shortages do we have, and can we find people to fill those shortages? Because otherwise, the jobs will disappear in the community. They will go unfilled, and the business will either suffer because of it, or will look to move that job elsewhere so that it can be filled in a place like, the 5 biggest cities in Canada that have absorbed much of the, untargeted immigration, or much of the kind of general immigration that comes to the country. So it's a huge success.
Mayor Chirko, if it was such a successful program, and Mayor Shoemaker and you seem to agree that it was, why did they wrap it up last August?
Well, again, it was a pilot program with an end date to it, and then they want to make it permanent. So they're retooling, they're relooking at it to make it targeted, I believe, so that our employers, and as Mayor Shoemaker mentioned, we had pretty close to the same numbers as they did as far as from employers that were looking for skilled labor and training opportunities through the various colleges, university, et cetera. So when we look at that, and we look at the growth in the immigration side of things, I think that they're just getting their numbers around it once again because of the issues that Matthew had pointed out regarding 5 major largest cities in Canada that were swamped with immigration. So they want to make it right. They want to make it so that it helps our northern communities, because the last 20 years have not been kind to Northern Ontario as far as immigration and population. It's been on decline, not improving on that. Birth rates, all of those things combined, we've seen decline. So this is the first boost that we've seen in probably since the late 50s or early 50s, late 50s, when there was massive immigration from Europe.
You mentioned IRCC, the Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada office, a moment ago. So let's do a quote from them. We got this just the other day from them. Sheldon put this up, and I'll read this for those listening on podcast. As announced in March, the Rural Community Immigration Pilot and Francophone Community Immigration Pilot are intended to help address labor shortages in small and medium-sized communities by attracting and retaining newcomers who are filling priority jobs. The new pilots will feature a new program design building on the success of RNIP, the one we've been talking about. All communities had the opportunity to apply to the new rural and francophone community immigration pilots in the spring through an open application process, which ended on July 16th, 2024, about 6 months ago. Selected communities have been notified and will soon be announced. More details will be released once the announcement takes place. Okay, so they liked, obviously, how well the last thing worked, and now they're coming up with a new one focused on rural and francophone communities. Mayor Shoemaker, you first. Have you been in touch with the feds on this, and if so, how's it looking?
Well, we have applied to the new program, the RCIP instead of RNIP, and have been in regular contact with them. We believe that per capita, we have had the most success of any community in the RNIP program. We were the first community of all the communities selected for RNIP that welcomed new immigrants through this program, through this fast track program. So we believe we have the best case to make for continuing in the new program, the RCIP. But the government is taking its time, I would say,
They got a few things going on these days.
Yes, they are. They do. I would say that it would be helpful, given that the program intake ended in February and the program invite permits wrapped up in August. It would be helpful if these announcements came as early as possible, because there is a backlog in jobs going unfilled that is harming our our economic prospects every day that this continues. So we're hopeful for a quick announcement from the federal government. Mayor
Chirko, how about you? Have you applied? Have you heard back yet?
We've applied. As Sue St. Marie has been, we've been in constant contact with them, looking at this program. And again, we're awaiting the announcement. As you say, Steve, there's a lot of things going on in Ottawa, so we're waiting patiently. But again, when we take a look at it right across Northern Ontario, there's approximately 17,000 unfilled jobs right across our entire north. And so the quicker, the better. We have people that want to come here. And just an anecdotal story, I met just before Christmas with a family that were one of our first nominees that came through. And they were from the Philippines, and they had never been outside of the Philippines. They've moved here for 4 years. They've had another child here in North Bay. And I said, what sparked you to come to Canada? And they said it was quality of life, safety for the children, an opportunity for the future. So when we look at that, and we look at, many of our backgrounds being immigrant sons, daughters, grandchildren of immigrants, that's what they came here for that opportunity. And I believe that the quicker we can get this underway, the better it is for all of Northern Ontario.
Well, I've never been in the position of giving politicians advice on these things, but it seems to me that if you both threatened the federal government with 25% tariffs on everything coming out of your two cities, I mean, that seems to be a tried, tested, and true way of getting the federal government's attention. Have you thought about that, Mayor Shoemaker?
We're on the border with the U.S., so we're familiar with the tariff threat and the use of it. We're more eager to actually get the program rolled out than to undertake things of that nature, which I think would be, hurtful for everybody. So I think that working with the feds to try and get this announcement rolled out as quick as possible to determine what the successful host communities are is the way to go about it.
Geez, I thought that was such a good idea. Anyway, okay, well, let me move on here. We'll get some numbers we're going to share here. In the fall of 2023, the Canadian government, as you both well remember, said they were going to notch up immigration to 500,000 new permanent residences in both this year, 25, and next year, 26. There was, you may recall, quite an adverse reaction to that. And so last October, the feds changed the numbers. And Sheldon, let's bring this stat graphic up here, and we will show everybody what the new targets are. For this year, not 500,000, but rather 395,000, so significantly lower. Next year, even less, 380,000 people. And the following year, 2027, 365,000 people, so significantly lower than the original 500,000 annual target. And I guess, okay, Mayor Chirico, you first on this. These reductions, how will they affect North Bay?
Well, I'm hoping that, when they look at this, that they don't paint the entire country with one brush. And I think that that's the big key in it. We do have to do a better job as a country with housing starts and be able to house people that move to Canada. But Northern Ontario and not just Northern Ontario, but rural Northern Canada, they can provide the housing. They can provide the ability for people to have those jobs. And again, it's a targeted rather than an open door. So I'm not concerned that those reductions in those numbers are going to be significant for Northern Ontario because we do see, and some of the surveys that we put out, that almost 86% of the approved newcomers to our community are still here in our city, which is tremendous. You're going to have people that are going to move. Some people use it, get here, they want the big city, they want Toronto. But what we have seen from that is that they've gone to the big city, Toronto, but they've moved back. It's too busy, it's too expensive, too much congestion, lack of housing, all of those things. So I think that our communities, all of our communities in Northern Ontario, are well served by those numbers, and I think it's a cautious approach to make sure that we are able to make sure that those people that do come to Canada have affordable housing, have that ability to have those positions in our communities.
I'm sad to be able to confirm that all of the things you just said about Ontario's capital city are quite accurate these days, and those of us who live there are occasionally frustrated at the way things are. Mayor Shoemaker, how about for you? That 20% reduction in open-ended immigration, how might that affect the zoo?
Well, what Our message is to the federal government is that RNIP is the solution to the open immigration policy.
But that program's over now.
The program is over, but it should be looked at as an example of how immigration can be corrected across the country. It worked in Atlantic Canada, it worked in Northern Ontario and in rural Canada, and it can be an example of how we can ensure that there is not this continual growth of our metropolitan areas, Toronto, Calgary, Vancouver, Montreal, that is unsustainable and that is creating, some high costs of living for people who are coming here and for people who have lived here for a long time. So using the northern communities, the rural communities, to ensure that there is settlement equalized across the country and across the province is a way that we can help those communities, because like I said, this was our first growth in 40 years. It was also a significant growth to our tax base. I mean, otherwise that tax base had been shrinking over the course of the last 40 years as well. So it is a way to stabilize the economics in our community. It is a way to stabilize the housing costs across the country, because in Sault Ste. Marie, we are building housing at a faster rate than the province says we need to be building it. So we are actually exceeding housing targets. We will have, if this trend continues, more housing available than a city like Toronto will, which is, not meeting the targets it needs to be able to house all the people that are coming to it. So a program like RNIP or RCIP, if we are successful in being one of the host communities, can be the solution or part of the solution to the immigration troubles that Canada is facing.
Let me get you to follow up on that, Mayor Chirico, in as much as, and I take no joy in saying this, but I have heard over the last many decades that one of the saddest exports from Northern Ontario are its young people. And I know that your two municipalities are doing what you can to try to make sure that young people stay in your communities or come to your communities because of the opportunities there. And I guess I want to know, these directed immigration programs, either the Northern program or the new rural program, or particularly in your two communities, the Francophone programs, because you do have strong Francophone communities there, how important do you think they are going to be in terms of keeping those population numbers up and the exports of young people down?
Well, I think it creates opportunities. When our businesses and our employers look out for trained, skilled workers to grow their business, if they don't have those skilled, trained workers and we're not generating them internally, then to grow their businesses and provide opportunities for our youth in our communities, I think that is one of the keys that we look at, because, listen, we were all kids and we all wanted to get away from home and we all wanted to go somewhere else and move somewhere else. My family is a prime example. I come from a family of 12. At one time, there was only 2 of us living in North Bay. Now there's only 1 living outside of North Bay. Everybody eventually came back, much sometimes to the chagrin of other people, but we all came back. But I think that providing those opportunities through this program for employers to grow their business, to have that economic stability in our communities, those are the things that drive growth, that will drive for new jobs, innovative jobs, jobs that don't exist today that will be 20 years from now for my grandkids. Those are the types of things that this program will help and be able to invest in our communities each and every year.
Not to get overly personal here, Mayor Shoemaker, but I mean, you're in your mid-30s. You are typically at the age where a lot of young people from the Soo have already left. They leave maybe to go for post-secondary education down south, and they don't come back. But you've stayed. How come?
Well, I love the Soo, obviously. That's why I want to give back to the community by serving it. But the reality is I determined at a young age that the Soo is the place where I belong. So it is the place where my family is, my wife's family. Our kids have been raised there. I loved being raised there. I thought it was a place where I felt safe, where I felt like I could contribute to the community, where I could be part of the community. I lived in Ottawa when I did my post-secondary education. It was a nice place, but it didn't have a sense of community that I came to expect of the place that I enjoyed living in.
Well, you know what they call Ottawa? 24 square miles surrounded by reality. So, yeah, okay, maybe you get more reality in Sault Ste. Marie.
The truth is, too, that tying into this program, Sault Ste. Marie is built on immigration. My own mother immigrated there because of the opportunity that it provided to Italian immigrants from in the post-war era, right? So she found that opportunity in Sault Ste. Marie. Someone who was born dirt floor poor in Italy came to Sault Ste. Marie, made a life with my dad and good steel plant wages, middle class living that offered my upbringing. The richness that it had in terms of quality of life. So I feel like I owe back to my community. But it's funny, in my generation, mid-30s, there are a lot more people who stayed than in even my brothers. My brothers were 7 or 8 years older than me, and he had a number of his close friends and colleagues who left. So there was a shift at some point when the economics turned and became easier to stay in the Soo, and most people who had the opportunity to stay did stay.
So that economic foundation then, Mayor Chirico, is obviously crucial to keeping people who are there. But I wonder, having said that, whether it's still a tough sell to get people who are not from North Bay to move to North Bay. What do you think?
The last 5 years have been quite an example of it. COVID, and I hate to bring that word up again, but, during the pandemic, we saw a vast inflow of residents from your communities, from the TT community up to North Bay, where they were able to find affordable housing, where they were able to find quality of life. And, Google is my best advertisement for North Bay, because when I get in the car at night and Google comes on and says, traffic heavy, 7 minutes. Those are the kinds of things that once people experience the North, and it's all of our communities, Sudbury, North Bay, Timmins, Sault Ste. Marie, Thunder Bay, all of them are the same, that we provide that affordable, and people are really taking a look at that work-life balance. And what is, people can get off work here at 4:30 and they can be fishing in one of our lakes in, 15 minutes. So those types of things, and the quality of life, the safety of our communities, all of those are attractions. And I do believe that things are going 360, and people are looking at, what is that quality of life and what does that city mean to me? We've got great partnerships that we work with on the RNEP, the Chamber, Yes Employment, our labor market group, our settlement services. So I believe once they get here that we'll keep them, and it will help that economic base to make sure that our kids have opportunities to grow within our communities.
Mayor Chirico gave an example a few minutes ago about a family that had come from the Philippines and had come to North Bay, settled, liked it, really enjoying things. How much of that, we see this obviously in Toronto all the time, but how much of that is visible in Sault Ste. Marie, where families are coming from halfway around the world, maybe have never seen snow before? They get through the shock of a Sault Ste. Marie winter, but actually stay and like it.
Yeah, well, a lot of it is comparable in Sault Ste. Marie. The common thread, I would say, among RNIP invitees is that they are all experiencing snow for the first time. Not all of them, but a significant portion of them are experiencing snow, and our retention rates are upwards of 75% as well. So excellent stats there in terms of people who come to the Soo and stay in the Soo. But we've got a family, Matt and Alice, in the community, came through RNIP, and he works at a machine shop from Brazil. And they were able to, they've been profiled in some articles, detailing the benefits of RNIP. But they were able to come to the Soo, afford a house. They moved from Brazil. They said the sense of security in Northern Ontario, or in Sault Ste. Marie specifically, is leaps and bounds ahead of where it was in Brazil. The commute is a fraction of the time. I can drive to work in 4 or 5 minutes from my, uptown house to my downtown office. And the ability to also employ spouses of people who are being targeted to these skilled labor forces is something that the city helps out with through our labor force development coordinator. So In Sault Ste. Marie, the mayor's job is, half the day that I work at City Hall and half the day that I work at a law office. At my law office, we have hired the spouse of one of the RNIP invitees, and they are loving, being in the Soo. They're loving everything that the Soo has to offer, and it is a true success story for the program and for businesses in the community who benefit from it.
In which case, I know that the two of you want to urge the federal government to put aside whatever issues they're dealing with right now and make a decision not only about this northern program that you've both enjoyed so much, but the rural and northern immigration pilot programs as well, which you hope to see coming very soon. Thanks to Mayor Peter Chirico from North Bay, Ontario, and Matthew Shoemaker from Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, for joining us tonight here at TVO. It's been great to have you both on. Thank you.
Thanks for having us, Steve.
Thanks for having us, Steve. It's always a pleasure.
In its fifth annual report on medical assistance in dying, Health Canada included demographics such as race, Indigenous identity, and disability in its findings. To discuss what the report says about who is requesting and receiving MAID and for what illnesses, we welcome in the nation's capital, James Downer, Clinical Research Chair in Palliative and End-of-Life Care in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Ottawa, and Rebecca Vachon, Program Director of Health at Cardis Canada. And joining us here in the studio, Sandy Buckman, Palliative Care Physician at North York General Hospital and Professor in the Department of Family and Community Medicine at the U of T, and Sonu Gand, Psychiatrist and Professor in the Temerty Faculty of Medicine at the University of Toronto as well. And we are delighted to have you two here in our studio in Toronto. And to our friends in the nation's capital, thank you for joining us as well. I want to start by just getting some of this background on the record here, and then we can continue to discuss after that. So I'll ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, to bring up this graphic, and I shall read along for those listening on podcast. Health Canada, in the year 2023, which is the last year for which data is available, received nearly 20,000 requests for MAID, and here's how it rolled out. More than 15,000 of those 20,000 received MAID. The remaining either died before receiving the service, were ineligible, or withdrew their requests. There was an overall increase year over year of about 15%, 2022 to 2023. 96% of recipients were in so-called Track 1, where death is reasonably foreseeable, their median age, 77 years old, and more men than women. 4% of recipients were in what they call Track 2, where death is not reasonably foreseeable, and the median age of that group was 75 years old, and in that group there were actually more women than men. Of the nearly 9,600 people who responded to questions about race and identity, 95% identified as white, 1.8% identified as East Asian, and about 110 people identified as Indigenous. And finally, a third of people in Track 1 identified as disabled, and 58% in Track 2 identified as having a disability. Okay, with all of those facts on the record now, let's just get some better understanding of what's going on out there. James, maybe we could start with your just helping us understand the difference between Track 1 and Track 2. Help us understand that.
That's right. So there are a number of criteria that make you eligible to receive medical assistance in dying in Canada if you want it. The vast majority, as you indicated, are so-called Track 1. So these are individuals who have a serious and incurable illness. They have reached a point where they're in an advanced state of irreversible decline in capability, and they're experiencing intolerable suffering. And these Track 1 cases are people where they say they have reached a point where their natural death is reasonably foreseeable. So that's commonly felt to be terminal illness, but it's not only terminal illness. So it could be people with a longer prognosis, but a clear trajectory towards death. Track 2, which is, as you indicated, the minority of situations, are individuals who meet all the other criteria, but they don't have, they have not reached a point where they have a natural death that is considered reasonably foreseeable. So they have a slightly different set of safeguards, specialists that need to be consulted, and a much longer evaluation period of at least 90 days in order to receive MAID.
Let me follow up on that last aspect with Sandy Buckman. Is there a difference in the way Track 1 and Track 2 people are assessed?
Yes, there is, Steve. First of all, we have to understand which category they fit in. Are they track 1 or are they track 2? And sometimes, that takes an assessment. You may have an older person who you could conceivably say they are trajectory of death. The law does not state the actual time period involved, but that it's definitely going down towards death, versus saying having more long-term chronic illness. And so we have to be able to make that assessment as to which track that they fit on. So that takes a lot of discussion, a lot of diagnostic information. But other times it can be fairly clear, okay, that this person definitely isn't on track 1, and that we have to sort of assess and get the different kind of assessments that we do for track 2 in place. For example, one of the clinicians who are evaluating the patient has to have expertise in the condition that you're evaluating. Or if they don't have expertise, they have to seek consultation, as well as there's a 90-day assessment period where you not only get those expert consultations, but you must inform the patient of all the options and get things like palliative care, support services, home services, disability services, etc., all in place during that 90-day assessment period, which is not the case in track 1.
Rebecca, let me bring you in at this point and ask you to draw, I guess, your main inference from all of those numbers that I just laid forward there. What's your big takeaway?
Well, one thing is just the increase that has continued year over year. We're now, as of 2023, the number of MAID deaths as a percentage of total deaths that year was 4.7%. And that's quite a far cry from the initial intention behind the Supreme Court decision, which talked about limited and exceptional circumstances, and nearly 1 in 5 deaths being from MAID is not limited and exceptional. And indeed, we now have the second highest rate of MAID as a percentage of deaths, total deaths in the world, second to only the Netherlands. But we got there in about 8 years compared to the decades it took for those international jurisdictions to get to that number.
Let me do a quick follow-up with you. I mean, we're a country of 40 million people, and we're talking about 15,000 deaths. Does that feel excessive to you?
It really does. Again, if you look back at the Supreme Court decision, we were talking about limited and exceptional circumstances. And what we're seeing bearing out from the numbers and the continued rise year over year is that this is becoming more and more normalized. This is not just another medical procedure. We need to remember that this was created as an exemption in the criminal code to something that would otherwise be against the criminal code. And so we need to take this very seriously because this is a final decision. This results in the premature death of a patient. And so we need to look very seriously at how the system is working and question if maybe we need to do better.
Sona, what's your view on whether 15,000 out of the 20,000 who applied is, in the words of Rebecca, excessive?
So what I would say is that, and first I want to thank you for bringing this nuanced discussion to the audience, because MAID is not only one thing. Different people choose or wish to die for different reasons. And that's how I would start off by answering your question, because I firmly believe that some of those deaths in that 15,000, most Canadians would think were wrongful deaths that should have not been provided and were provided for reasons they did not envision MAID to be provided for. And just following up on one of Dr. Vachon's points, she mentioned the rapid growth that no other country has had in the short number of years since we've had MAID here. We've now, as of 2023, had more deaths by MAID than by COVID. And in terms of the question you asked about the numbers, it's important that your audience realizes this is not actually just for terminal illness. Track 1 has a very long potential prognosis of up to 10 years of life, roughly, is what it's seen to be. We're not very good at guessing terminality for 2 or 3 years. We're terrible at guessing it for 10 years. And track 2, as you know, has no kind of element of even being in the process of dying. And the problem, and I think we'll get to discuss this in a few minutes, the problem with all of that is that the further and further away you get from the process of dying, what we start to see is that life suffering, things like poverty, loneliness and isolation, and other psychological traits and symptoms start to influence people's wish to die. So it becomes life suffering rather than avoiding a painful death, which is very different.
James, can I get you to react to the statements of our last two guests?
So I think there's a lot of focus on the numbers of people receiving MAID. I don't think that that's actually appropriate. First of all, we're seeing large growth in the use of MAID around the world in every jurisdiction that legalized it, particularly since the start of COVID. And I think you're seeing fairly rapid growth in Australia. The Netherlands and Belgium, for example, had been quite stable at their numbers for a long time until COVID, and then they've both taken off. So I think a lot of what you're seeing in Canada is the simple fact that we legalized shortly before COVID, and that gives you that number. But the broader question of whether the number actually even matters, I think, is the core question. MAID wasn't about providing MAID. MAID is about providing choice. So the question isn't whether it's 2, 3, or 4%, but whether it's 100% of people getting the care that they want, and whether we are following the rules as they are set out in law. And every piece of data we have suggests that that's the case.
Sandy, are you troubled by any of the numbers here?
No, I'm not troubled by the numbers. I think I can reiterate that Canadians have chosen to recognize autonomy as their prime value, the choice to do it. And I think there's a growth curve that's kind of reflecting Canadians' awareness of that choice and the expression of their autonomy. As well, I think it's also expected. We are an aging population. We're a growing population. We're suffering more and more with chronic disease. And so the fact that we're seeing this increase over time, which hasn't been a huge increase, but yes, fast. We're just in the early stages. We've only been doing this since mid-2016, so it really hasn't been all that long. And so, no, I think the fact that we have choice in Canada is a reflection of the choice that Canadians have made.
James, would you be concerned if more people were choosing to do MAID, not because death was certain or because they were in significant pain, but rather for poverty reasons, for mental health reasons, for loneliness reasons? Would that be a problem for you?
Well, so those aren't actually, number one, those aren't the reasons outlined in law that would make one eligible to receive MAID. Secondly, and I think, and we can go, I think you're going to go into the data as well to show that that's not actually the reason people are getting MAID either. I think you have to recognize that poverty, loneliness, these are all major sources of suffering among Canadians. If we're concerned about those, we should be, and we should be focusing on ways to improve to narrow the mortality gap and the illness gap between Canada's wealthiest and Canada's poorest. We should be trying to support our marginalized communities a lot more than we currently are. But again, the idea that, and again, the data certainly shows that people receiving MAID are certainly not disproportionately represented among these populations, quite the contrary, and that comments like loneliness or self-perceived burden and things like this that people are flagging are actually as common or often more common among people who are not seeking MAID. So I think that's really important to recognize.
Rebecca, can I get you to comment on that? I mean, the fact is, it is not a provision in law that you're allowed to take your own life because you're lonely or because you're poor. So what's the concern on your part for that?
Well, the Health Canada report does reflect the nature of suffering. The data collected shows that a considerable number. And I think one of the concerning things is that it shows that an increase over last year's numbers do identify social isolation and loneliness as a source of suffering, as well as the perception of being a burden. We really don't know from the data how these play out in terms of ranking, but the fact that there is this social suffering that is part of what is recognized in the data collection process, I think should make us look very carefully at the supports being provided to people. And we do know that there are people receiving MAID who did not receive palliative care, who required but did not receive disability supports. And actually the number of cases of that in particular grew 2 times the amount last year. Almost over 400 people were identified as having required but not receiving disability care. So all of these things, again, should give us pause and should, I think, focus our attention on alleviating the suffering before we are providing an assistance in dying. We need to provide assistance in living.
Fair enough, but Sonu, let me make sure we're crystal clear on this. There's nobody in Canada getting MAID because they're lonely or poor, is there?
Yes.
There are.
There are. You know, I think it's a bit disingenuous for it to be suggested that loneliness and feeling a burden are not fueling MAID requests when nearly half of the people on track 2 identify feeling a burden, nearly half of the people on track 2 identify feeling lonely as suffering fueling their MAID requests. Over 40% on track 1, by the way, identify feeling a burden, and over 1 in 5 on track 1 identify also feeling lonely.
They identify that, but that doesn't give them the right to do it, does it?
But that's an artificial distinction you're making, and I think this is part of the dangerous reassurance that people have been provided by, frankly, what I would call some whitewashing of some of the data, because there are actually signals in the data that show people are being driven to seek MAID by those considerations. The one thing I would agree with Dr. Downer on is that the total number is not what the big issue is. It's the reasons fueling people's suffering, leading to their MAID requests, that we should be looking at.
Sandy, can I get you to speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I actually couldn't agree more with the comments about intolerable suffering and how we have to address it. You know, when I hear a patient say to me, I want MAID, I actually hear them say, Dr. Buckman, my life is intolerable, help me. That's my cue to go in and investigate their intolerable suffering in all its domains. You know, physical, like pain, nausea, vomiting, psychosocial, cultural, you know, the loss of being the caregiver or the breadwinner of the family, and of course spiritual and existential suffering. So it's a key, and in assessments of any part, it's not just, oh, you want MAID, here you go. No, it's a deep investigation and addressing of their intolerable suffering. And loneliness, social isolation, many of these things are key, and particularly with marginalized people where they're suffering with poverty or they're having housing, they're in a housing crisis, what have you, food insecurity. Yes, we do see that. Those absolutely have to be addressed. And it's incumbent upon clinicians to begin to get all the services, mental health services, counseling, everything in place, whether it's a track 1 or not. These things are common in the illnesses that we see. And as an assessor, I'm not granting eligibility on the basis of social isolation or loneliness or poverty.
Well, that's what I wanted to check. If somebody comes to you and says, I'm desperately depressed, I'm lonely, I don't want to live anymore, I want MAID, are you granting it under those circumstances?
I'm not granting it under those circumstances until I've assessed if they meet the eligibility criteria. And remember, it's again about autonomy. That patient actually has the right to refuse. They can be depressed, but if they have the absolute capacity to understand and appreciate their situations, then they have actually right. I might do my damnedest to try to get them that mental health care that they need, but they actually have a right to refuse if they have capacity to make that decision.
Rebecca, do those sound like adequate safeguards to you?
I really appreciate that there are clinicians like Dr. Buckman who are going to those lengths to try and address suffering, but it's not what is required under the law, and we really don't have the data collection through the annual report to ensure that that kind of investigation is happening and that those supports are provided. The law doesn't require patients to actually have tried means to address their suffering. It just has to be offered. And when you're dealing with a system that has so many issues with availability and access and quality of care, that has structural barriers for persons living with disabilities, that has structural barriers for those living with mental illness, it can be very, very difficult to meaningfully understand what those means of relieving their suffering could involve. If you haven't received proper mental health treatment, if you've been on the list for disability supports for ages, what does it mean if someone tells you that you could have that. When is it going to be there, and what quality will it be there? So unfortunately, I don't think that the current situation really is working in that way. And I think the voices of disability advocates and some of the really concerning cases we've seen in the media bear that out.
James, can I get you to speak to the issue of how confident you are that the assessments that are taking place of people who want MAID are on the up and up?
Well, I think again, it's one thing if somebody can ask for MAID. You can ask for things for which you are not eligible. That's part of why you have the safeguards and the assessment processes in place. What I've seen among colleagues, and certainly in my own involvement in MAID in the past, it has been, this is what we do. When someone comes in with a type of a suffering that you think is something you can address, you do your darndest to connect them with the services required. I will say that in the federal report, they actually did specifically look at that among people, not just whether they had access, but whether they had a type of suffering and where the assessor felt that this person could have benefited from a service but did not have access to it. And out of 15,000 cases, as you pointed out, for disability services and for palliative supportive services, they identified 5 and 6 individuals out of 15,000 that they felt could have benefited from services and did not have access. But let's be clear, that number should be 0. Absolutely should be 0. And I would have a lot of concerns in situations where I felt somebody didn't have access to a service that they could benefit from. But I think we also have to recognize, number one, that those numbers are spectacularly good compared to, any country on the planet would be envious of those numbers for all people dying. And I suggest to me that by and large, I think our assessment processes and our safeguards are doing a very, very good job. Certainly the number of MAID cases we can say that are related to inability to access services that could benefit people is an extremely low number if it is not 0.
Sonu, can I get you on that as well? How well do you think we are assessing, or that assessment process in general, is it on the up and up?
So I think that most MAID providers are doing their best to do what they can to make these assessments. My concern is what the data and evidence shows, which is that despite their attempts, they're unable to filter out the very things that you're asking whether or not they can be filtered out. So an assessor may not say, I'm providing this for loneliness, but the point is that we don't compartmentalize suffering. We respond to cumulative suffering. There's a concept called total pain, which Dame Cicely Saunders, who's was a stalwart in palliative medicine, coined, and it reflects not just physical pain, but existential pain, psychological pain, social suffering pain as well. And what the reality shows is that we can't filter that out from these MAID requests, especially for people who are far from having a terminal illness. In other words, people who are disabled and have more time to live. And what also we find is that those factors map precisely onto the same things that we know are suicide risk factors. I think that it's important people realize some of the data being presented does not convey the full picture. The Ontario coroner, Dr. Downer referenced the Ontario reports, I believe. The Ontario coroner actually himself concluded in a presentation he gave last spring that there is a significantly higher number of people on track 2 who come from communities that have residential instability, material deprivation, and dependency on track 2. We also find that, as you pointed out at the beginning, more women than men actually get track 2 MAID, and we're seeing that more people are getting it for nebulous circumstances like hearing loss and frailty that are harder to quantify what is the full degree of suffering. So I don't think we have adequate safeguards, despite the fact most providers do their best.
Sandy, I want to ask you about one of the numbers that jumped out at me, which was 95% of the people seeking this are white. What does that say?
What does it say? It reflects, I think, a few things. If we look at the socioeconomic gradients and who gets MAID, and the white Caucasian population tends to be in Canada more established and has a population, a higher socioeconomic status, because we see people of higher socioeconomic status who are requesting MAID. And people who are aware, people who have more education that MAID exists, people who have greater control in their life. of their lives. And those are the kind of individuals that are seeking to have MAID. It's actually anecdotally those that have less control, okay, for whatever reasons they have, from systemic race issues to disability, who have less control, are asking for it less. They're experiencing the social isolations, they're experiencing that. But the poverty, the marginalization, those other issues, race, are not driving MAID. Okay, and yeah, I'll leave it there for a moment.
Okay, Rebecca, does that mean, can I draw the inference that as so-called racialized Canadians become more socially connected, become more economically advantaged, that we will start to see those numbers rise in those communities as well?
That's a good question. I don't think that based on the data we have, we can come to any firm conclusions. The demographic data collected in the Health Canada reporting, they note themselves specifically that there are challenges and inconsistencies and different definitions. So there's a lot of caveats that come with that. But by and large, I don't think race should be fundamentally something that makes us feel better or worse about who's accessing MAID, because anyone who's approaching their death or who is requesting MAID is in a really vulnerable condition. And so we do need to be ensuring that we are addressing those sources of suffering that are driving those requests, and as Dr. Gain points out, might be driving those requests inappropriately. We hear a lot, and this is not from the report, but I think really important to consider the lived experiences of persons living with disabilities, to consider the voices of disability groups, including the coalition of disability groups and 2 individual plaintiffs that filed a charter challenge against the government this past fall because they are arguing that Track 2 is discriminatory against persons with disabilities. And we've seen these really difficult cases play out in the media. So I think we need to balance that data point that, while interesting, may not give us the full picture of some real issues of concern.
James, I guess it does introduce an interesting angle on this story, which is, there is discrimination in many other aspects of society. Is there discrimination in terms of who gets MAID?
I'll just pick up on a point that was raised earlier, though, about some of these measures of vulnerability and marginalization, because I think that there's some data being misrepresented here. Both the Ontario data and the federal data consistently show very much the same thing. So there are a number of metrics that are shown in both of them. So income, whether you're receiving government supports, education, racialization, and whether you're a newcomer to Canada, and whether your dwelling is in need of repairs. By every one of those metrics, MAID recipients in both Track 1 and Track 2 are on average more privileged than the average Canadian. The average Canadian who has advanced illness, the average Canadian who is dying, right? So every one of those metrics is associated with a lower chance of getting MAID. The only one that Dr. Gain is referenced here, the residential instability, actually has nothing to do with whether you yourself are stably housed or the quality of your dwelling. It actually relates to a metric about the neighborhood you live in and whether people move in and out frequently. So any neighborhood with a lot of seniors will rank as marginalized. I'll give you an example. Toronto's Yorkville neighborhood, which most would consider to be one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Canada, by that metric is actually considered one of the most marginalized neighborhoods in Canada. I don't think any person would consider Yorkville to be a neighborhood of marginalization or be concerned from somebody coming from that neighborhood. So we have to be really clear on what we're looking at with this data. When it comes to specifics, the coroner's reports also did look at individual cases and had a multidisciplinary panel, including people who were very much opposed to MAID and have been principally opposed to MAID for a long time. And in none of those cases, they went over 6 cases that they felt were most emblematic of perhaps the social concerns, et cetera. And after review, they didn't conclude in any of those cases that somebody was receiving MAID because of social issues, and in some cases, quite solidly, we're saying that was not the case. Certainly, housing, in no case did they conclude that anybody received it because of poor housing. That's really important to say. The question of discrimination and the question of what disabled people and marginalized people are experiencing, I think, is very clear. We know that by every single metric of marginalization gives you a higher risk of death, a higher risk of illness, illness and suffering across the board. That's well known. The problem is that every single metric of marginalization also makes you less likely to get MAID. So if we're going to talk about the issues that are really affecting people with disabilities, people who are marginalized, I think MAID is probably the last thing we should be speaking about.
Okay, we're down to our last couple of minutes here, and I guess, Sonu, I want to ask you, we've had MAID in Canada now for almost 10 years. Has it essentially unfolded as you thought it would?
I think we've fallen off a cliff. And the reason I say that is that, and with respect, I have to say that some of the last comments from Dr. Downer, again, that's another whitewashing of the data, because in fact, the argument that people who have disabilities are likely to suffer more from certain reasons, and then they get MAID anyways, or that they're in some of these areas that the Ontario Coroner's Report does show that they come from, and they would get higher rates of MAID anyways because they're suffering or would have higher rates of death. On track 2, none of those people, not a single one of those people, would have lost their life if it had not been taken through MAID. They would have lived for over 10 years. So it's a fallacy to compare whether people in those situations would have died at higher rates anyways. And in fact, that argument is indistinguishable, frankly, from eugenics. So I do think we've gone over a cliff because we are not properly making, and by the way, I am actually not a conscientious objector. I chaired my former hospital's MAID team, and I would never have done that if I didn't agree with what most Canadians agree with, which is that there is a place for MAID here. But what we have seen is actually activism that has led to what I would call, it's almost suicide denial, because in some cases it is unequivocally clear that some people are being driven to seek MAID and get MAID for traditional suicidality markers. And when we're talking then about expanding it to mental illness in a few years, you can just imagine what would happen.
I've got to jump in there because that's our time. I want to thank the four of you for coming onto this program tonight to have a very difficult decision about a very contentious issue, but I commend all of you for having such a civilized discussion about it. We're really grateful. James Downer, Rebecca Vachon, Sandy Buckman, Sonu Gand. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.
And that is the agenda for Wednesday, January 15th, 2025. Tomorrow on the program, we'll hear from one Canadian about his devastating experience during the Los Angeles wildfires. You won't want to miss that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.